All right. Hello. My name is Scott MacArthur. I'm a Senior Supportability Program Manager with the Surface Group. Welcome to the breakout session 4300, which is Scratching the Surface Lessons from Support. So we're going to talk about some of the issues we've seen with Surface and some best practice around the device. I'm going to let my compatriots here introduce themselves also.
So my name is Antonio Vasconcelos. I'm a PFE, Premier Field Engineer, based in Portugal, working in the EMEA region, and I naturally work a lot with Windows, client, Surface deployments, and everything related to.
So my name is Kyle Blagg. I'm also a Premier Field Engineer, actually based in Atlanta. So I actually pretty much work exclusively on Surface-related projects with a variety of different customers. One of my primary responsibilities is basically working with the NFL and making sure pretty much everything that we do with them runs off as successful as possible, and making sure that basically we give them the best product as possible. Obviously, it's a large team that ultimately makes that happen, so it's quite the undertaking. So there you go.
Okay. I want to just start out with one question. How many people in the room own a Surface Pro 3?
Whoa.
Anybody buy a Surface 3 also this week? Okay. Well, thank you. So let's see here. All right. So the agenda today is we're going to talk about some of the common enterprise Surface issues that Microsoft Support has seen and works on. We're going to also talk about some best practices and guidance. And then what we'll do at the end is have a Q&A. And we'll try to make sure we get out here on time so everybody can go to the party, which is right here. So you picked a good place to end the day. So first thing I just wanted to talk about is that the Surface Product Group is listening. The Microsoft support teams, we work real closely with that product team, and when we see issues, we bubble those issues up to that team. Those can be issues based on customer cases, forum posts, MVPs, and the product team is great about providing new drivers and firmware to address any issues and also add new functionality to the device. So one of the biggest lessons we learned is that a lot of the issues that have come in with Surface actually haven't been Surface. They've been Windows 8.1 issues. What we've seen is Surface Pro 3, a lot of times for enterprise customers, is their first exposure to Windows 8.1. So there's some things there you have to learn about how to manage and deploy devices, and so that's been a common thing we've seen, is a lot of them are just Windows issues. One of the areas that seems to get a lot of discussion is connected standby. So what is connected standby? So this is basically a low power energy state with network connectivity. If you've been to, I delivered a few theater sessions that talked about this, so we're some similar content here, but the benefits of connected standby is instant resume. Also, we have network connectivity while we're in connected standby, and while we're in connected standby, modern apps can update themselves. Plus, since the network connectivity, as you roam around from access point to access point, you're not having to wait for the device to reconnect to wireless. It's already connected. Example with the modern apps is that when you open up the device, the start screen tiles are up to date. The important thing is that the connected standby is not a Surface Pro 3 only feature. There are other devices out there that support it. Dell Venue Pro 8 and a lot of other devices support it. One of the areas that tends to confuse people a little bit is that there's limited power customization options, and we do that on purpose. We want Windows to kind of manage the power settings and policies so that we can make sure that you get a great battery life. So there are not a lot of customization you can do there. A number of applications are not connected standby aware, software like VPN software and things like that. They generally need an updated version in order for that to understand connected standby, which is a sleep state. The other big issue is when you buy a Surface Pro 3 out of the box, the device will, after 4 hours in connected standby, hibernate. If you are deploying a custom image to your device, that configuration is not present. So I've listed a KB article here, and what that KB article just has a couple of Power CFG commands that you run to reconfigure the device so that it hibernates after 4 hours. You can add that to an MDT task sequence or just a batch file, or you can run the commands manually. Okay, so for power management, we've had questions around how long is the battery lasting, what is consuming the battery while in connected standby. And we've, inside of Windows, we have a Power CFG command line tool that you can use this tool to help you diagnose issues related to power. And these settings, the Power CFG commands will work on any device. It's Windows 8.1 or later. So the first one is Power CFG Energy. This gives you just some general settings that might impact your battery life. And then / battery report. This gives you more detailed battery information such as cycle count, full charge capacity. Sleep study is specific to connected standby, and that gives you kind of detailed information on the different sessions. And when you're running that command, I just recommend add this duration 28, so it's 28 days, so you have a larger amount of data to look at to get trends. One thing about this log file is that it's only going to log sessions that are greater than 10 minutes. So if you close the lid and then open it real quickly, that particular connected standby session won't be logged. Okay. Take a look here. So I'm going to take a look at a couple of Power CFG, some output, so you can get an idea of what those log files look like. Okay, so this is the Power CFG / energy output. You can see at the top we have just some general information about the machine and the biostate, what the platform role slate, and the first area is.
Hey, Scott, can you make it a little bit bigger? The font's fairly small on the screen.
Yeah, that's good. There we go.
Thank you.
Okay. So these first three items here are some items that we've identified as potential things that are going to affect your battery life. Just an example here, if some device or service or application is preventing your machine from going into sleep, that will affect your battery life, obviously. So what I did here, just to give an example here, is I started up the music app, and when I ran the energy report here, since music was playing, that's going to prevent the device from going into sleep. If you have a device that won't go into sleep, another command you can use is Power CFG / requests. It'll tell you what is currently blocking the machine from going into sleep. The second item is it's pointing out that a USB device attached to the Surface Pro 3 doesn't support selective suspend, so this is going to have an effect on our battery life. And in this case, it was just a flash drive I had plugged in. This could be other USB devices, and it's just pointing out that they may affect your battery life. You also get some information about any processes that are significantly using the CPU or consuming time on it. And then at the bottom here, we have information on what power plan is in place. So like right now, we have the balanced power plan. And it gives you a real quick section here about the battery, cycle count, and your design capacity, and what your last charge was.
I'm sorry, is outside of the Surface environment?
Yes, it's part of Windows.
And is it something that's available in Windows 7? Because that's what I have on the desktop.
It is there, but the question is the Power CFG part of Windows 7? It is there. It won't have sleep study. I believe it is only going to have energy. I'm not sure about battery report.
Request wouldn't be there.
/ energy would work, but I don't.
The request, yes, to know which devices are
Oh yeah,
important. Yes,
/ request. Yes,
definitely.
that's there. Okay, so let's take a look at a battery report. So this is going to show us whatever batteries we have in here. I can see, what's the design capacity of the battery, what the full charge is, cycle count. So I've gone through basically 37 cycles on this battery. It's going to show me recent usage of the device, when I was in connected standby, when I was active, and so on. One thing about these reports is when you're looking at this, you're going to have to correlate a lot of this to event logs and kind of what the user was doing. So you have to, if the user's complaining about battery life, you may have to say, well, what did you do with the device? Did you put it in the bag, take it home, things like that. So that way you can correlate what's going on with the battery to what the user's doing with the machine.
How do these reports help me improve battery life?
I'll show that to you.
Great.
Next one. The battery capacity history, this is kind of the chemical part of the battery. If it's degrading, I'm not a battery expert, but you can see if there's a significant degradation. For most people, they want to know what is my battery life? What's my average battery life? And if you come down here to the very bottom here, you can see that on this is from my Surface Pro 3 that I kind of use daily driver. I'm getting about 8 hours of battery life and about 55 hours in connected standby. So that's pretty good. So the last one I want to look at is a sleep study report. So to look at that one, I'm going to just give you an example of how I use this output to help on with an internal Microsoft employee. He came to me and said, "Hey, I'm really not getting good battery life. Just not real happy with it." So I had him. I had a couple ideas of what may be affecting it. I said, "Well, go ahead and send me a sleep study report." So when I opened up his sleep study report, so the sleep study report, you can see these are the connected standby sessions that have occurred on the machine. The green is where there's low system activity, orange moderate, and red high. There's a lot of red here, but that's not necessarily bad. When we're in connected standby, there's lots of things that can be going on there. We could be downloading and installing Windows Update. Group policy could be applying to the machine. And the thing is that we do these things and then we quickly try to bring the device back down to a low battery state. So when I opened this sleep study report up here, one of the first things I noticed was the duration of some of these sessions. So I see durations of 16 hours, 12 hours, 48 hours. And for me, that was an immediate clue that his machine was not configured to hibernate after 4 hours. So what's probably happening here is at the end of the day, he's closing the lid on the device, throwing it in the bag, and going home, and then the battery's just running out overnight. Whereas with my device, I put it in my bag, go home. By the time I get home, the device is hibernated and pretty much not using any power. So what this report should usually look like is, I'll show you on my device. So if you look at these sessions here, most of them are 4 hours or under, and you can see there, session 15 is 4 hours, session 11 is 4 hours. Now, there is one session here that's was a little bit of concerning for me was this one right here, session 51. So I'm not too concerned about the sessions that are, this is charged, that's when the device is charging, but when I see a high drain rate here, like, so my device here, it spent 17 hours in connected standby, and it drained pretty much my whole battery. So I went back, figured out what was I doing on 4/30, 2015 at around 8 o'clock. And I remember that I was sitting on my couch watching some build videos. And for whatever reason, possibly I left the build video running and maybe I closed the lid or the IE didn't completely, the media player didn't completely close. So basically I closed it, went to bed. It prevented my device from hibernating, and it caused a significant drain on it. When I look at this session, so when you click on a session, it takes you down here to see some additional information. You can see here the audio driver was active. And so basically my deduction there is, for whatever reason, that was preventing the device from going to sleep or hibernating. Okay. I think that's it. Let me,
The demo again?
Yep.
yeah. No, I'm already yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna, sorry. I'm gonna hand it off to Kyle.
Thanks, Scott. So basically for now, we're going to actually talk about the actual deploying of the Surface. So how many people actually use MDT or SCCM to deploy images? For those of you who didn't raise your hand, what do you use, out of curiosity? Well, yeah, MDT or SCCM, either way. I'm sorry? Okay. Anything else besides ZenWorks? Okay. So from a reference image standpoint, we're going to actually recommend using MDT to create that reference image. Basically, the intent of creating that reference image or that golden image is basically you want to make it as lean as possible. You want to make sure that it's basically designed to be as lean as possible so that way when you deploy it across your network, you're not taking a bunch of extra bandwidth as a result. The other part, too, is you don't want to have all of your drivers injected into that image for all of the different devices that you have in your environment. You want to have logic built in that says, okay, if this model is a Surface Pro 3, then apply the Surface Pro 3 drivers. So as a result of that, MDT 2013 is the current version, or SCCM or System Center Configuration Manager 2012 R2, so you can use either way. Generally, from a reference image standpoint, create it with MDT. You can always import that into SCCM and deploy it through your normal mechanisms that way as well. So one of the things that we're going to show in just a minute, and it's one of the questions that usually comes up when you talk about deploying Surface and specifically using SCCM, is because we don't have an actual USB or a network adapter built into the device, you typically have to utilize a USB NIC. So then from an SCCM standpoint, that NIC is then associated with a particular computer. So in just a minute, we'll actually show, when I do the demo for another thing, we'll actually show you a blog that kind of talks about a process to kind of help you get past that as a hurdle. So like I said, use MDT to actually create that reference image. Only add the applications that you need for that's specific basically across the entire enterprise. Typically, you're going to leave out your antivirus as well as any application that's not necessarily going to go to every single user. Utilize the Hyper-V Gen 1 VMs, so that way we can make the VM as simple as possible. And then use the selection profiles once you actually get down to actually deploying those images. So basically what that means is there's a variety of different kind of thoughts, if you will. Niehaus and Aaron Chakowski just had a session on deployment as well. But basically you're going to use some sort of logic to determine what drivers go to that particular device. Typically it can be done through WMI, or there's other mechanisms as well. But you want to make sure that you're specifically saying if the device is a Surface Pro 3, then apply this driver set. Don't just throw all of your drivers into a big folder and let Windows plug and play actually try to figure it out. So if you want an example walkthrough, there's a link there. And don't worry, the deck is actually going to be available online as well, so don't worry about the hyperlinks and knowing what the link is in the background. So one of the other things that comes up is PIXI. So what about PIXI? So the Surface Pro 3 is a Class 3 UFI. So there are some kind of gotchas that you need to be aware of. So if you're planning to use WDS for that to actually be your PIXI environment, then obviously make sure you're using a 2008 R2 or 2012 boot image as part of that. So the other part about deploying to a UFI device is, and there was a couple sessions in the actual Surface booth that this was discussed, but you actually need to use the architecture appropriate boot image for that device. So you'll actually have to use the x64 boot image to deploy to a UFI device. You can't use the x86 for everything anymore. So from a DHC scope option standpoint, so if you're currently using 66 and 67 to basically be able to deploy to your BIOS devices, you'll actually want to switch that over to IP helpers because it can't coexist for when you're deploying BIOS and UFI class devices.
Could it work if you're just done staging area just for UFI?
Do I now?
If you have a staging area and you're just doing UFI, is that right? Or
Do you know, Scott? I don't do a lot of the networking stuff, so.
You can use, if you use 66 and 67 instead of IP helper table entries, you have to pick your boot file, and there's a boot file for non-UFI and a boot file for UFI. So you could choose, you could,
as long as you're not mixing, you're good.
yeah, if you don't have a mixed environment.
Okay. So these are some of the common issues that I've seen with a number of different customers. So from a secure boot environment, who knows what secure boot is? About a third. So basically what secure boot is a feature that's built into Windows that makes sure that malware doesn't get in and ultimately get up under the OS and modify your OS files. So that way you know that you're always launching a good copy of Windows. You don't have to worry about the malware injecting itself there. So obviously from a UFI environment, it's an option there versus with BIOS, you don't have that ability. One of the other things is partition structure. So about 2 months ago, I had a customer that I went to that they were going through their deployment process with their particular mechanism that they use for deployment. And basically what it was a sector by sector image. So as part of their image, they had all of their partitions. Well, the problem that they were running into was their image that they had created was actually for BIOS devices. So if you look up here, there's one thing that's missing from a UFI standpoint. There's an MSR partition that's required for UFI. So because they're deploying their BIOS kind of partition layout to these devices, whenever the Surface Pro 3 tried to boot up with their image, it just went straight into UFI because it didn't, as far as it knew, there was no OS there. So a lot of it is the Surface Pro 3 is one of their first UFI devices in their environment. So there is some kind of change that has to go on from a deployment standpoint and certain things that you need to be aware of. All right. So like I said, because it's one of the first devices that they typically experience from a UFI standpoint, there are some things that you may need to change in your environment to account for that. Partition structure is one of those things. If you're using MDT or System Center for Configuration Manager, it automatically basically creates the appropriate partition, so you don't have to worry about that. If you're using any of the other tools or you're still doing a command line, then obviously you need to take that into account as part of that. Boot image architecture, I just hit on that a few minutes ago, so you will need to actually use an x64 boot image if you plan to do PIXI. And then, of course, if you plan to still deploy an x86 image, then you'll need to do that one as well. FAT32 limitations. So in order for you to be able to boot to a USB, so let's say you need to do a recovery image or you're going to do a USB-based deployment, then you're actually going to have to create the USB in a FAT32 format. So with that, there are actually some limitations. So basically, you're limited to 4 gigabyte file size. So how many of you corporate images is bigger than 4 gigs? I bet a bunch of you. Yeah. So that may be a problem there. So there's some logic built in that you can ultimately split that WIM to be able to do those USB-based deployments. The other part is you're limited to a 32 gigabyte partition. So if you're planning on using a 64 gig USB device to do your deployments, then the biggest partition you're going to be able to have on that device is 32 gigabytes. So one of the kind of workarounds is if you use essentially a Windows to Go certified device, those actually register as a fixed disk. So what that allows you to do is be able to create multiple partitions on that device. So you can create your boot partition as a FAT32 that has your basic files, but then you can create a larger NTFS permission that actually will allow you to store your full image. So obviously you'll need to adjust your deployment mechanism to look to that secondary directory as part of your task sequence. So from a power setting standpoint, Scott's already hit on this a little bit, but I guarantee you every single person that came over to the booth over the last 4 days that complained about power, it was because of connected standby. They didn't have the appropriate power settings applied to their device. So there's a KB that Scott linked earlier. Make sure you have those applied. There's a KB itself, and then of course there's some power settings. So make sure you apply those to your devices in order to take full advantage of the capabilities of connected standby. Legacy GPOs. The customer I was talking about that had the partition-related issue, one of the other ones that they were doing was they were pushing out their Windows, I think it started on XP, power scheme to their Surface Pro 3 devices. Needless to say, it was not a pretty experience. The battery life was horrible. The device was getting warmer than it should have. And of course, they had no idea that they were doing this, but because they had it applied at the domain level, it was coming down to everybody. So make sure you look at your GPOs, specifically if it's going to be power related, because a lot of the settings that may have come out as part of your XP and Windows 7 days may not really be designed for Windows 8.1. So there's some things that you need to look at there. So if you want to exempt your Surface Pro devices altogether from those power profiles, then you can do that, obviously, through blocking the inheritance, and then you could target the devices specifically through WMI. One of the other big questions we get is, can I load Windows 7 on my Surface Pro whatever? No, from a supported configuration standpoint, it's Windows 8.1 and above. So the Surface Pro 3 and the Surface 3, so the one that just came out this week, will both fully support Windows 10. So once it comes out later this year, you can ultimately deploy that as well. So drivers and firmware. So one of the things that Scott mentioned was the fact that they're constantly updating drivers and firmware, and it's a lot of times there's obviously some bugs and whatnot that are resolved, but in most cases there's actually a lot of enterprise features that are being added. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that we're regularly giving you these updates. So if you go back to essentially when the Surface Pro 3 launched and look at basically that version of the firmware, there were very limited options of what you could do. You couldn't do an asset tag, you couldn't disable your camera, you couldn't disable the SD card port. So there wasn't a whole lot of options, versus now you have all those features, and a lot of that came as a result of enterprise feedback of saying, hey, we want the ability to be able to manage these particular settings. So basically we give all of our drivers up on the website. So as of right now, we put them in two different formats. We put them in the MSI for the Pro 3 as well as the zip file, and same thing for the Surface 3. So that way, if you're actually getting ready to deploy a corporate image to your devices, you would obviously use the zip file, import them into MDT, import them into Configuration Manager, obviously use a selection profile or some mechanism similar to deploy those directly to the devices. So then the caveat of that, or the opposite of that rather, is what if you already have devices out in your environment? What do you do then? Because if you don't go out to Windows Update manually to get those drivers and firmware, your devices are going to never have that. So I've been to a number of customers that they manage their updates through WSUS, SCCM, or some other mechanism to do that. So the problem with that is you never actually get prompted to install the latest drivers and firmware. So I've seen countless number of devices that still have the OEM firmware that it left the factory with. Same thing from a driver standpoint. So a lot of the problems that they're running into are ones that have been fixed for sometimes many months now. So we came out with the MSI, so that way you can actually deploy it as an application through Configuration Manager or some other software deployment mechanism. And it does fully support running it command line, doing a quiet install. So that should allow you to get those latest drivers and firmware out to your devices that are already deployed.
Works okay with BitLocker?
Yes, works okay with BitLocker. So all of our Microsoft devices are BitLockered. Devando, every time there's a new update that comes out, I apply it, and I don't think it's ever triggered BitLocker recovery for me. So if you look here from a content standpoint, this is actually out of date as of yesterday. The Surface 3 drivers from a zip file and an MSI format are now out there as well. So if you're getting ready to start getting ready to deploy Surface 3, the drivers are already out there ready to go for you. So the other part that was down at the bottom, so the Surface Firmware Tool, who's heard of that? Of course, the clowns in the front row did because they worked on it. So how many was it? About three? 3 or 4? Okay. So as part of a lot of the feedback that we got was, okay, now we have the ability to manage, the ability to enable Bluetooth, disable Wi-Fi, disable network PXE, control the boot order, all these different things. Well, what do I do for devices that are already out in my environment? Or what if I've got 10,000 surfaces? I really don't feel like touching every single device to be able to manage those settings. So what they did was created this, basically it's a firmware tool that allows you to actually utilize PowerShell to manipulate those settings. And actually going to do a demo for that in just a few minutes as well. So as I mentioned, from updating a firmware and driver standpoint, so as of right now, Windows Update does not have the ability to push it out through WSUS and or Configuration Manager. So if your clients are out there in the wild and they need to be able to update it, you'll need to push it out through as a package through Configuration Manager, or they can go to Windows Update directly and run it themselves, or of course they can go to the actual driver's download site and download the MSI and run it themselves. So from an MSI installer standpoint, like I said, use it for those devices that are already deployed in your environment. It does support quiet and unattended installation. The way it actually does the installation in the background is it uses dpinst to actually apply those drivers to the devices. So in the case of firmware, obviously it's going to go ahead and apply it, and then if basically the next time you restart, assuming it has a particular battery threshold, it will go ahead and apply that firmware. If it doesn't meet that threshold, then it'll basically try it the next go around at the reboot, as long as the battery threshold is above that certain percentage. It is added to, I'll come back to you in just a second. It's added to the add and remove program, so that way if you're doing software inventory on your devices, you can actively see what applications are installed, so that will show up in that list, so that way you'll know which devices have it and which devices do not have it. And I did mention the battery charge validation. So it has to be a certain percentage in order for firmware to be applied.
You just mentioned about WSUS Config Manager. Are both supported or is only one supported?
So Configuration Manager in the sense of pushing out Windows updates. So it obviously is fully supported from an application or app package standpoint.
But WSUS does work with firmware updates, does it?
Say that again?
WSUS does work with firmware updates, does it?
Not currently, no.
We're getting them.
You're getting them through Windows Update. So WSUS is essentially an internal version of... No. Can't push firmware out through Windows or WSUS. Okay. And you can have your devices configured for both. So they can reach out manually to Windows Update to get updates as well.
Is that going to be remediated for Config Manager at some point, or is that just something that we have to live with?
That would have to be a question for the Configuration Manager team.
Does it only cover Surface Pro 3?
For what? No, drivers and firmware, it's more of a WSUS limitation, not necessarily a Surface problem. It's not going to cover any devices. It won't go out through Windows or through WSUS. Oh, gotcha. So yes, as of right now, the MSI is limited to the Surface Pro 3 and the Surface 3. So from a deploying driver standpoint, so one of the things, if you look at this, so this is the way it looks now, versus if you remember it from a couple months ago, it was actually broken down into vendor. So it would be Marvell and Intel and all the other different ones. So people who are deploying this through MDT or SCCM, they're used to having it basically identified by category. So we've actually kind of changed the way we did that a little bit, and now it's actually, if you go to the download center, download it and extract it, this is actually what it's going to look like. So.
Do you apply the previous fix to the current version of firmware?
So they're incremental. So if, let's say you just bought a brand new device and it's running the firmware from, let's say, October for some reason. If you go ahead and apply the MSI from today, it'll give you the fixes that were applied as part of any of the previous ones. And we'll have time plenty of time at the end. So we've scheduled at least about 40 minutes just for questions alone. So we want to make sure we got all your questions answered. So from a Eufy enterprise management standpoint, like I said, this is a result of some of the feedback that we've heard directly from our customers. So going back to Scott's point of the product team is listening, this is a perfect example of that. So it gives us a variety of different options to be able to control those, and we'll go into some of the specifics there. So from an asset tag information, so essentially it's a DOS command that you would run from command prompt. And then the one requirement is obviously that you need the actual executable itself, but you also have to have Eufy version 39150 or above. So obviously once you get to that level and above, then you'll actually be able to use the Surface Pro 3 asset tool tag. So from an acceptable character standpoint, so that kind of gives you an idea of what you can include as part of that asset tag. So that way you can apply it to your devices. So from a Surface Pro 3 firmware tool standpoint, like I said, it allows you to manage it via Eufy, or PowerShell rather. You do need at least 3.11.760, which was the most recent firmware that came out, 2 weeks ago? Is that right? And then it does require the .NET assembly. So that MSI that we were talking about earlier that's on the software download center, you'll need to make sure that that's installed on your devices prior to being able to manage that. So that way it allows you to basically communicate directly with the firmware. So with that, we'll go to the demo. 7. So this is one of the blogs that we put together. So this one is on the AskPFE platforms. So basically what it is, it kind of outlines the requirements as well as some kind of how-to and kind of general walkthrough of how to do it. So this kind of shows you how you would do a silent install. So obviously if you were doing it through Configuration Manager, you would apply it this way, and you would just apply that as part of there. So from there, there's a load command that's very specific, so make sure you copy and paste this correctly. There's also a TechNet article as well that the product team put together that outlines all of this as well. So one of the reasons we put this together to kind of augment the one that the product team put together was basically what we did was created a function that allows you to basically set these variables and ultimately set those settings accordingly. So let's go ahead and look at what that looks like. So like I said, the first thing was make sure you got the correct version of Eufy on your device. So the easiest way to verify that is if you go into Device Manager under Firmware, there's going to be a Surface Pro Eufy. And then, of course, on this one, so we've got the 760. So we're good to go from a firmware standpoint. The other part is you need the MSI installed. So in that case, for the sake of time, I've already installed it. But basically, if you go through it, if you do it non-quiet, then obviously it'll give you the UI. Otherwise, you won't see anything. So for the sake of time, we went ahead and installed that as well. So from here, basically, it's just a PowerShell script that launches. It automatically connects into the Eufy Manager, and I'm providing it the password. So in this case, I used a super secret password, which I was actually doing some testing there, so that's the only reason it looks like that. So that way, through one command, you can basically load the Eufy. It automatically unlocks it based on that particular password. So from there, I have the ability to now manipulate the variables or the values that are set in the register or in the firmware. So if we go up here, there's this function right here called Get Eufy Options. So we don't expect you to know, okay, what can I set? How should I set it? What are the correct values that we should set? So if we come down here and run that, can you see that okay? Is that big enough for everybody in the back? Okay. So basically, if I run it, then it gives me all of these different options, right? So it tells me what the name of the particular setting is, and then if you look at the current value and then allowed value, so in this particular case, for a docking port standpoint, I currently have it disabled. And then if you look at the default value, you see the default is actually enabled. So you can see that I've went in and actually changed that at some point in time. And then from a camera standpoint, you can see it's enabled and whatnot. So the other thing is once you make a setting change, you'll notice that there's a new field that's populated. So let's go down here. Let's run this one. So we're going to change the boot order. So by default, the boot order is going to be 4, which is SSD only. So if I run get UFI options again, so now you'll see that under proposed value, it shows a 2 there. So what I essentially just did, without having to manipulate the actual firmware on the device through restarting, holding the volume up key, going in and touching it, I now can do it through a PowerShell function. Obviously, you would automate this from a standpoint of some sort of script that you would deploy to your devices. But hopefully this kind of gives you some insight as to how easy it can be to change those. So what I did in this case was basically I gave all the different settings that I could set as well as its different settings. Now, obviously, I've got it commented out so I didn't accidentally disable everything on my system. And then after I do the next restart, those options will now be the current values there. So if you see or if you saw it, it said proposed value is now 2 for a boot order. So when I restart, that option will take effect. So one of the questions that comes up is, what about password? Because that is one of the fields that you can see. So if you look, it has a current value of star. So even if they run this and they get this cool PowerShell script, they're not going to be able to see what the current password is. So it'll just show a star. Okay. Yes. So you will set the password the first time, and then as part of the kind of the load function that I have here, there's an unlock command where basically you're passing it the password. So what I did was set it to basically give it a parameter. That way I can define it there. So obviously you don't want to just give this script out to anybody and everybody because now your super secret password is out there. So you need to obviously secure that just like you would your deployment shares and whatnot. But it gives you the ability to automate it in your environment. So now you can set all those. And I know Bilal, in one of his sessions in the theater, stressed the importance of securing the UFI. So one of the benefits of doing that is to make sure that somebody can't load an alternative, basically put in a USB stick, boot Linux, and ultimately hack into your device, provided that you don't have BitLocker enabled and whatnot. So anyway, with that said, turn it over to Antonio. Yes. Don't recommend it, though. So, because basically you're making your OS vulnerable at that point. Correct. Yeah. So there's, just like all these other settings, there's I think it's FE to enable it. But it tells you what the value is to put there. So, thank you.
All right. Thank you. Yeah. Hey, there you go. So what about wireless? I saw a lot of hands up of people that already have a Surface. How many of you had issues with wireless? All right. They're fixed. You're good. Okay. So this week in Bilad's and João's session, and Brett also, we kind of discussed that this is our new baby. Like Surface Pro, Surface, we're building this from the ground up. And we're learning also with the mistakes, naturally. But the Marvell chipset was built really from scratch. And we comply with all the norms, all the standards. And by doing that, we kind of hurt ourselves. Because the other OEMs already have a lot of experience in this field, and they have workarounds for a lot of the connections to the access point problems that you experience with the Surface. Hence why we released a huge amount of drivers on a very fast pace to solve all of that. And let me tell you that also right now, to repeat Brett's information, we have a huge test lab with a lot of access points to make sure that we have the majority of the APs that enterprises use nowadays to mitigate any issue with Wi-Fi connection. Still, and for more of a troubleshoot purpose, we added in the latest driver in the 151 released in January, an option to select the band setting between 5 gigahertz and 2.4 gigahertz. Again, this should be only done if you really know what you're doing in terms of configuration of wireless and you want to test or troubleshoot any connection issues with your access points at your office. By default, it's in auto, so it means that we will give preference to 5 gigahertz only if the signal is weaker, or if your wireless distribution systems or roaming settings tell the access point, which is in the 5 band, to direct the device to a 2.4 band.
That doesn't matter. So if some networks, they broadcast the same SSID for both bands?
It's not about the SSID. It's really a question of communication between the client and the access points and the wireless distribution system, all of the rules that are applied there to access points communicate between them and know which band. I mean, this isn't a roaming setting, obviously, but the access point is capable of doing 2.4 for a 2.4 device if that's needed to. Naturally, the 5 gigahertz has a lot more speed. It's a different latency signal, but it has less power, meaning that on a higher distance from the access point, it might be difficult to connect. But this has nothing to do with Surface, right? This is normal Wi-Fi specifications. As for Miracast, did I click something? Okay, sorry, thank you. If you choose to go 5 gigahertz only manually on that setting, be careful because Miracast will not be able to function because the authentication, the initial connection is done through 2.4, right? So that might also trigger other issues. Please make sure that you know what you're doing. Just use this for testing. And if you need to report any issues back to Microsoft support, please make sure that you include as much as information as you can, like from access point, model, firmware version, what kind of settings are you using, so we can troubleshoot as quick as possible also and give you an answer back. Another issue that we recurrently see is customers using old versions of antiviruses and VPN softwares. Cisco AnyConnect is a very popular one. And I can really tell you that it's quite common to find older versions of AnyConnect, and they are not even compatible with Windows 8, let alone Windows 8.1. And what you see is the device either doesn't transition to a connected standby state or a hibernate state, or it actually gives you a blue screen, because that driver was, for example, not certified by the driver development kit from the Windows 8.1. So please pay attention to that. Make sure you talk to your vendor that is supplying the antivirus or the VPN software. I've seen it from Check Point, from Cisco, from McAfee, I mean, multiple ones. If that version that you have is supported for the operating system and for connected standby devices, okay? I think I haven't skipped anything. Not?
I had one thing.
Sure.
So just one thing to add about the wireless. We've had some customers say, why is my Surface Pro 3 attaching to the 2.4 network versus 5? And when we've investigated that issue, what we found is the algorithm we use here is that we prefer the 5 gigahertz unless the 2.4 signal is stronger. And what the recommendation to kind of address that kind of scenario is on most access points, there's a feature called band steering, where what it does is it purposely lowers the 2.4 signal strength, and that way everybody ends up on 5 gigahertz. So that's come up quite a bit, and just a lot of out-of-date firmware on access points. So that's just something to look at.
And now moving on to Miracast. We received a lot of reports with issues with connections to Miracast, and the majority of them are related really to the Intel driver. It was not pushed as a GDR, as a general release through Windows Update, because not all of the customers reported this issue. It's not that generic. We received some reports. But anyways, it's available. If you are experiencing connection issues with Miracast, please do try that driver and see if it solves. Now, troubleshooting Miracast connections, it might not be that easy. You might go really into debug or network analysis. And it also might be related to wireless interference. So again, a lot of factors that can affect Miracast connections. Other issues that we have seen also, firewall rules not allowing the connection to be established. Your own Miracast receiver firmware that might need to have a firmware update to actually mitigate or solve an issue connecting to our device. And again, the same thing that I repeated on the previous slides, the 2.4 gigahertz band disabled, not allowing to the initial connection to be established. Docking and cables and display ports, awesome. We received a lot of questions about this during this week at the booth, and a lot of people were quite interested to see the setup with the triple monitor and asking a lot of questions around display link and daisy chain, I'm sorry. I mean, this is all possible, works very well. Just make sure that you use accessories which are certified, named as designed for Surface. We have a list online of those. But if you are uncertain, please make sure that you use Microsoft devices, just at least to test that, if it really works or not, if it's a problem with the accessory, or if it's really a problem that you have just discovered. Monitors, and this on the DisplayPort specifically, and the daisy chaining. We also received a lot of reports from certain monitors with certain firmwares not complying to the DisplayPort 1.2 certification. And customers reported things like the image might not be, it's kind of shaky, power issues, or input to the second monitor not working. Because daisy chaining is you have two monitors that allow input and output through your DisplayPort. And the second monitor actually receives the feed from the first monitor. And if that monitor is not really DisplayPort 1.2 compliant, it will have issues for certain, at least the first one, which is emitting the signal to the second one. Make sure that you talk to your vendor. Majority of those monitors, if they need a firmware upgrade, they are not upgradable at the field, so they need to be replaced, right? There's a question, yes? I think that normally that requires a very complex active conversion signal. It might not be that.
HDMI, you have one for HDMI, you have one for VGA. It kind of would make sense there is no VGA. What about a third-party one? I have a third-party one. I understand that. Here's why there wasn't any.
I don't know. I don't know the answer for that one, but I can try to look up just for curiosity. Out of curiosity, do you know?
Those are the most popular connection types. So VGA and HDMI are the two types of inputs that you will see on your screens. The screens that have DVI, they usually also have other types of
And it
connections.
does, yeah. Most monitors do. I was just curious why, out of the three choices, that was the one that was.
Market share then.
It depends on what is popular.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, João. In terms of options, like I referred, we have the DisplayPort and the daisy chain to connect multiple monitors. We support up to 3 monitors, including the monitor from the device. The multi-stream hubs that you saw at the booth was connecting, was obviously outputting from the DisplayPort to media DisplayPort to 2 DisplayPorts, and then connected to those 27-inch monitors. And DisplayLink also. But be careful that DisplayLink will use a lot of CPU, depending on, again, on the CPU you have and the drivers that you have installed. Sure.
You can use this on quite a few devices with docking station, and so far it works well, but it's the observation that in maybe 20-30% of the cases, when you dock it, it does not properly recognize that it's set up to darken the device itself or use the 2 monitors. And this is flaky. I mean, it works 50%, plug it in, and it immediately shows the 2 monitors, and it's going off on the screen here on the device itself.
Really?
But in about 30%, I think it's having this one on and one of the monitors on.
Again, be sure that the device is certified. Are you using certified devices?
The new HP V24 monitors, which are displayed on
No. Okay. Do we have any reports on those?
It's actually on the list of Microsoft Control, I think.
Yeah, we've had some cases on that particular monitor, and I know Redmond is now investigating that. probably you're going to end up probably being a firmware update from HP that's going to have to come, but it is something we're looking at. I remember that model number, so.
Thanks, Scott. Thank you. Was there any other question? I thought I saw someone. No?
So the firmware upgrades, in most cases, that's not something you can do in the field. You have to actually exchange the monitor. So best thing I can do if you're having problems with monitors is open a case with the monitor with the OEM, Dell, HP, and a case with us, and so we can collaborate and work on it.
Well, I can add that for HP, it worked in one case, we have quite a few of them, that they send us a little device to program the monitors and make a feedback. This was for a previous version of the monitor.
Okay.
So HP is very flexible. It took about 3 months to get this worked out, but they did it eventually.
All right. Thank you. So do check the firmware, because if you're saying that 30% of those cases do not work, it might be a question of being a different firmware on those monitors. Thank you. Another common issue, and this was obviously something that it's quite evident in the Surface device because it has a huge resolution and also a huge DPI. Like you see there, it's 216 ppi, which is by default the double of a normal 24-inch monitor, 1080p. And yes, Windows, it's not perfect managing that scaling. It's not only a fault from Windows also, it's also part of the applications. If you use applications with bitmaps, we cannot scale that, right? It doesn't scale. Yes, we know there are certain components in Windows that still do not scale properly. We are working on that. We improved a lot with Windows 8.1, but Windows 10, we hope that it will improve a lot, if not fix that. Question?
Regarding that, do you know if in Windows 10 I can set separate zoom for the UI elements in different screens?
You don't know that. And again, it's not finished. It's not GA. Once it's out, we'll have this.
Because Windows 8.1 indeed improved a lot from the
The automatic scaling, yeah.
mostly when you're using Miracast to project and you have the native resolution on the screen, and when you project you have a smaller 720 TV or projector, the interface elements are huge and you get much less.
Again, I hope so. I don't know the final setting that will be in the general availability of the OS, but remember that it's not only a OS issue. If the application is not scaling properly because it has bitmap resources, we're not going to do magic on that. Still, like I said, Windows 8.1, and you referred also, improved a lot with the automatic scaling. We do try to do that automatically, detecting which DPI setting should be more appropriate for all of the monitors that are connected. And you can see here, for example, the different scaling settings according to the size of the screens. But it's a challenge right now with Windows 8.1. We know that. We hope to improve that with Windows 10. I forgot anything? I think not. What's happening there? Can you pass this up? Thank you. Thank you. Here's the representation of the single DPI scaling and the automatic per display DPI scaling that Windows 8.1 introduced. And as you can see, it's obviously much, much better. Those are the monitors that were used for this test, and you can see that very different sizes and very different DPIs. So actually, it does a good job, right? But this is not across the board, and developers also have to at least adopt our scaling specifications that we are releasing with Windows 10 also. CPUs. It's important to understand the difference between the CPUs and really what are your needs. A lot of people will choose the i7 just because it's an i7, it's probably safer, but you might not need it actually. Just be sure to understand what are your requirements in terms of technical needs or softwares, because an i3 might be more than sufficient. And just to detail the differences between those, an i3 has a 11.5 watt TDP. It doesn't have any turbo boost, while the i5 and the i7 have. And both the i5 and i7, that's also a recurrent question, they have the same TDP. The only difference to the i7 is that you'll have a different GPU. And that will actually might be a nice requirement, no, a nice outcome if you have a requirement of an application that really requires more GPU power. The i7 and the i5 have vPro, but they do not support remote BIOS config or AMT. Okay, it's a subset. Battery life should be almost the same across those three CPUs. So do not think that the i7 will have less life, battery life than the i3. Naturally, they will be more or less the same. Obviously, there are going to be differences, but if everything is properly configured in terms of power policies or power settings, drivers, and etc., they will have the same kind of battery life.
So the different models will have also different batteries, or is it just optimization between models?
I think the batteries are the same, correct? Yeah, they are. So it's just difference on the CPU and the GPU for the i7, actually, which is an embedded GPU, naturally. It's an Haswell architecture. Sometimes what happens is you just need more RAM. So try to pick up more configurations with 8 gigabytes of RAM, because that will suffice for your needs, and you actually don't need to pay more for a higher CPU. Another thing that it's not that known is that the i7 unlocks the 512 gigabyte SSD. That's the only configuration that will have that SSD.
What do you mean by unlock?
It's the only option where it's available for you to acquire that. Not unlocks. Yeah, automatically, it's magic. It grows automatically. No. Yeah. And after talking CPUs, why not thermal? Also during this week, we had a lot of people stating that, oh yeah, my device is running hot. We say warm, because warm is expected, right? Especially if you have an i7 Haswell CPU in this form factor, but never think that it will be hot. We comply with all the handled specifications for temperatures, and we're actually quite below of the maximum trigger points for touch temperatures. We'll shut down the device way below those regulations that you see here, or the maximum that are temperatures that are defined on those regulations. So you might feel warm on the right side where the CPU is, but it's not that warm. It might be the same temperature as your warm water when you're taking a shower at home. If the device is really becoming hot, it will shut down itself. You'll see that. Okay, so no worries with that. Just make sure that, and we have a lot of reported issues from customers where the CPU is really hot, right, or warm, and the fan doesn't go off because they have something running in the background, probably their antiviruses, their management system that is always consuming CPU, a lot of CPU, and naturally we have to have the fan on to control the temperature of such CPUs like i5s and i7s. But again, it's not going across that safe border, because if it was, we will shut down the device immediately.
What would be the average percentage you would estimate of the fan coming on and off? Is there any value what would
As far as I know, the fan will kick at 48, is it degrees?
Oh, sure.
Yep, 48 degrees. So it's not the percentage, right? It's what triggers the temperature on the CPU.
Is there any chance in to be announced in the future next model that there will be no fan? Any chance of that?
Surface 3.
Who knows? Everything is possible. I don't know. No, just joking.
Yep, Surface 3.
Oh yeah, Surface 3, yeah. But it's an Atom CPU naturally, so less heat generation. I don't know. This is all dependent also on Intel, right? So whatever Intel makes up for the future, we might end up profiting, but I don't know about any plans of fanless Pro devices. Question?
One of the things I found, and it's been actually documented in all the forums, is that Chrome wakes up the CPU 1,000 times a second because it's also an OS. So
love you. Thank you.
So, the way Chrome is designed to run on Windows, by design, because Chrome is also an OS, it's not just a browser, and so it's always waiting for you to be able to do things, refresh things, if you're looking at things.
So yeah,
And so it would heat up, my fan would be on all the time, which I was like, keep reading Chrome. So as it's Chrome off the thing, and it doesn't get hot anymore, and the fan never gets it, or hardly ever gets it, hopefully the next thing.
when you install Chrome, there's a lot of things that it adds up. A couple of scheduled tasks, startup, and probably the scheduled tasks were triggering the device because it automatically updates constantly. So be sure to. Okay, thank you.
Very good. We're good.
Thank you. Well, that will be cool. That will be cool. Question there.
Yeah, just with respect to the fan, is there any recommended maintenance in terms of cleaning out the grill or anything like that?
Just make sure not to block the vents. I would say that
If there's dust or pet hair or anything like that, you shoot the...
only if that's really, really massive. Otherwise, I mean, I've been using mine for 2 years, or almost 2 years, and never did any maintenance. Okay. Just make sure that the cases that you buy, any covers that you buy, do not block the vents. That's it. Right. Thank you. I don't need this. Talking about disk or SSD, we also received some reports that some devices were not booting. The SSD was unavailable, I mean. And those cases were actually, the majority of them were tracked to an issue with the driver. So the deployment of your image were actually, during the deployment of your image, because if you're not filtering to the correct driver, you might be using an incorrect driver, right? The eStora A.sys, which is the Intel Storage Matrix storage driver from Microsoft. Instead of the Store HCI, which is the correct one for Surface Pro 3. So please make sure that you import and filter the correct drivers during the provisioning of your machine, or just use the MSI at the end of the task if you really want to make sure. But we just issued a new fix, was like last week? Last week, yeah, the MSI last week, exactly to mitigate that issue if you are experiencing that. Another one, and this is only, oh, please, go ahead.
I can just clarify a little bit about the first case that Antonio was saying, that was mentioning. What happens is multiple devices will use different controllers, different drivers, and if you're not filtering your drivers in Microsoft Deployment Toolkit or Configuration Manager or any other tool, if you're just adding a bunch of drivers to your image and letting Windows or your device pick up the best one, they may not always pick up the right one. And what was happening is that sometimes when you had drivers for multiple different devices, the controller drivers, like the iStore A.sys is actually a controller driver that wasn't made for Surface Pro 3, that was never in our driver pack. But if it was left there, sometimes Windows would pick up that driver instead of picking up the correct driver for Surface Pro 3, and we would run into issues. So now what we did was we put what we call a 4-part ID that makes sure that we match that driver exactly to the controller, and that we avoid problems like this, that we prevent other drivers, other third-party drivers from coming into our device when we should be picking up the correct one.
Thank you. Another thing that we detected, and specifically on the Samsung SSDs, and this is something, again, specific to this model, which it's an OEM model, right? It's a specific model of SSD for Surface coming from Samsung, that when they write the information to the cells, they're sometimes not applying the correct power voltage to that cell, which means that the information will decay with time. So when you need to read the information from that cell again, they need to do multiple passes to get back the information, and that degrades the performance of the device. So basically, we are waiting for a firmware release from Samsung. A while back, they released a release candidate, and they pulled it out. So please make sure that you check out Samsung Samsung support websites to when the firmware comes out to apply to your devices if you have SSDs from Samsung on Surface Pro 3. It's not ours. It's Samsung firmware. Got it? Just go to the device manager and check that. Any WMI query will give you the brand. Okay, wiping policy, also a very recurrent question. How do I make sure that Microsoft wipes my data, my personal data, because I cannot remove the disk, right? It's not possible to remove the disk from the Surface. We comply with all the wiping policies, especially the ones for DoD and NIST. The information is securely erased with vendors' tools also, so it's quite secure. Do not worry with that. All the wiping policy, data wiping policy, it's available. The information is available online. I've actually not referred the website here, but we can give you that if you want. Another question is repair versus replace. No, we cannot repair the devices. That's why it's always a replace scenario. And the user or the technician repair, it's something that you should not do, right? If you try to open the Surface, you most definitely will crack it completely. It's not supposed to be repaired. There's no screws, right? I've heard. So, where to go if you need more info? Surface TechNet, we presented this during the week at the booth. Is there any more sessions about this tomorrow? No? Okay. So Surface TechNet, Surface for IT Pros blog, the Ask the Core Team blog, a lot of content from Surface there on Windows, and the Community Surface forums to make sure that you have all of the info. Additional resources. Also, please take pictures if you want.
And all this is going to be in the PowerPoint that's going to be uploaded to the website.
Exactly.
So don't worry about what those hot links are.
And that's a wrap.
Yep.
Questions?
Good questions.
Thank you. Question there?
And don't leave yet because we got something, maybe.
Maybe.
We were early deployers of the Surface Pro 3, and there was a conflict with Hyper-V and Connected Standby.
Oh, yeah.
And they just told us to disable Hyper-V, and that was Premier Support case answer. I think I heard it was fixed, but I don't know.
The latest Wi-Fi driver, which was one of the blockers for the Connected Standby with Hyper-V.
So if we have the latest everything, we can turn Hyper-V.
The one in 151 should supposedly solve that issues with Connected Standby and Hyper-V. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so the issue we fixed was when Hyper-V was enabled, there were some issues coming out of Connected Standby with wireless. We fixed that, but with Hyper-V installed, Connected Standby is still disabled. So working on that for Windows 10. A good option for that is you can set up a boot entry in your BCD store. So when you turn on the device, you can say, I need to boot to an environment where I need to use Hyper-V or not. So like if you're doing development work, need to get into a VM, you can do that. But then like when you're at a show like this, you just go to the other mode, and that way you get all the benefits of Connected Standby and better battery life and all that.
So hold on.
When you enable Hyper-V, it actually gives you more power state options.
Yeah, it turns off Connected Standby. Yeah, we're changing that. I would be those options. I would not recommend changing anything in there. Changing those options will write there's a registry key called PnP capabilities. Yes. And so if you change it from anything, what the default is, the default is 10. If you change it to something else, you're going to create a lot of issues. So if you feel like you need to change those settings, I would be very interested in understanding why you want to change those. Yeah, it can get you into trouble. So
what was your question, sir?
When you were talking about power, and we apply custom image and having a lot of issues with Connected Standby and hibernation. Mm-hmm. So across all of our services that we deployed, they have a really hard time coming back from sleep. We'll hit the power button and just nothing will happen.
Yeah.
That addresses
More than likely. So go look at on the Ask Core, which is one of Scott's blogs. Yeah, so the question was, they're having a number of issues with having the device responding whenever they try to turn the device back on, or so essentially resuming from sleep. So chances are it's because of that power policy, because it doesn't really know how to come back out of sleep because those power settings aren't applicable or
Yeah.
applied to that device.
I'd want to look at the power settings that have been configured. And another thing, which is, I know it's simple, but pressing the button, sometimes there is a little bit of a delay, and then what happens is people get impatient, and then they press it again, and then they press it again, and sometimes it does take a little time to come out. It's certainly not more than, 10 to anything above 10 to 12 seconds would be abnormal. But sometimes I'll press the power button, and it's like, oh, that didn't wake up. Try the keyboard, and
We don't do anything to the power settings, but it is a custom load. So, like that today, it happened to me. I went to lunch, I came back, I hit the keyboard, nothing happened.
Yeah.
Hit the button.
Windows
nothing.
8.1?
Excuse me?
Windows 8.1?
No, 10.
Oh.
Mine's 10, but everybody else is 8.1.
So that's a different issue altogether. But yes, connected standby and Windows 10 is not exactly perfect yet. Yeah. Okay, ma'am.
Yeah, what is the best tool to create USB bootable images for the Surface Pro? So we have like field, Surface Pros, and we want them to be able to just boot to a USB drive and re-image on the fly as needed.
So the question was, what is the best or quickest mechanism of being able to create bootable USB sticks so that the people in the field can re-image their devices as needed? So the short answer would be it depends, which is never the fun answer. So it depends on how you're actually deploying your images. Now, are you talking about a custom image for your environment, or are you talking about the OEM image? So for a custom image, then if you're using MDT or SCCM, you have the ability to create offline media, and that will be a USB that's bootable and whatnot.
But one thing there, you have to think about how big your image is, which goes back to the 4
Correct.
gig file size, individual file size limitation. To use a media deployment on a UFI-based machine, you will have to. There's a block. Yeah, well, you can either use a Windows to Go drive, like Kyle talked about, or you can. There's a workaround so that you can use that media deployment. That Ask Core blog. If you go check up on that blog, it talks about how do I use a media deployment with a UFI-based machine, and it gives us the steps to do that.
All right, so since we're technically over, we're going to at least go ahead and do the fun part. No, Milad, you cannot have it. So, all right, so we've actually kind of, basically, if you look in either your shirt or your sleeve, if you find my business card in there, you won. All right.